He boarded the flight alone, with his school paying for the seat and his dad's quiet warning still fresh in his mind. He followed every rule, spoke politely, sat in the right row. But the flight attendant kept staring, then whispered. Minutes later, she called someone. And before the plane even took off, he was asked to leave his seat. No reason, no explanation. But when his father showed up, everything changed. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you don't miss the next one. Cairo Bell sat alone near gate 42, hugging his backpack with both arms. His eyes kept shifting between the boarding sign and his phone screen. He had read the flight details 5 times already, just to be sure. It was his first time flying without family. The robotics competition in Seattle was a big deal, and his school had covered the cost because he'd won the state tech fair. Everyone clapped for him when he received the medal. But now, with his hoodie sleeves pulled halfway over his palms and his shoelaces double knotted, Cairo didn't feel like a winner. He felt small. As the boarding announcement began, he waited for Group 3. His seat was 6C, business class. He had memorized it just like his dad told him. Stay calm, be polite, and keep your ID ready at all times, Lieutenant Dorian Bell had said that morning, before dropping him off at the terminal in uniform. Cairo had nodded. He knew what his dad meant, even if he didn't say it out loud. When Cairo stepped onto the plane, the air smelled like lemon polish and stale coffee. He moved carefully through the narrow aisle, counting rows. Row 6. He stopped and reached up to place his backpack in the overhead bin. That's when the flight attendant appeared beside him. Her name tag read Marla Weston. Her blonde hair was tied in a tight bun, and her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "You sure you're in this section, sweetheart?" she asked, tilting her head. Cairo pulled out his boarding pass and handed it to her without saying anything. His fingers shook slightly. Marla looked at it, then back at him. All right. She didn't apologize, just walked away, like he'd caused a minor inconvenience. Behind him, someone coughed and muttered, "Wrong row, probably." Cairo slid into his seat, his heart thudding against his ribs. He tried to shake it off. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe she was just doing her job. He buckled his seatbelt and glanced out the window, trying to focus on the clouds forming above the tarmac. But he could still feel her eyes checking on him from the front of the cabin. And even before the plane left the ground, Cairo Bell had a feeling this flight would be remembered for the wrong reason. The other 2 seats in row 6 filled up slowly. A tall man in a navy blazer took the aisle seat and gave Cairo a quick glance, then shifted in his seat as if needing more space. The woman by the window kept her purse on her lap, not saying a word. Cairo stayed quiet. He opened his laptop, hoping the familiar screen would calm his nerves. His competition slides were saved on the desktop, a clean design showing his hand-built sensor robot that detected motion using ultrasonic pulses. He'd worked on it for months, but now, staring at it, he couldn't focus. Marla walked by again, slowly this time. Her eyes locked on his screen for a second too long. Cairo noticed it but pretended not to. She paused near his row, adjusted a tray on the cart, then leaned toward the woman in the window seat. "Let me know if anything makes you uncomfortable," she whispered, just loud enough for Cairo to hear. The woman nodded without looking up. Cairo's throat tightened. He looked around. No one else seemed to notice, or care. The rows behind him were filling up with passengers chatting, pulling out neck pillows, laughing softly. But all that sound felt far away. He sank deeper into his seat and closed his laptop. His phone buzzed. A text from his dad. "Flight on time?" Cairo replied. "Boarded." Some weird vibes, though. He didn't want to worry him, but the tension in his chest hadn't gone away. Marla walked back toward the front of the cabin, this time whispering to another crew member near the galley. The man turned to look briefly in Cairo's direction, then nodded and picked up a small notepad. Cairo looked down at his own hands. He hadn't done anything. He hadn't said a word. But something had shifted the moment he stepped on that plane. and he could feel it settling in around him like cold air, heavy and quiet. 10 minutes passed, maybe more, but Cairo felt like he hadn't moved. His hands stayed folded in his lap, his knees tight together. He had planned to review his project one last time, maybe listen to music, but now every movement felt risky, like standing up might make someone think he was doing something wrong. Marla came back again, this time slower, holding a small silver tray with drinks. Her voice was bright when she spoke to the man in 6A. "Can I get you a white wine, sir? Or would you prefer the sparkling water?" He smiled and chose the wine. She laughed at something he said, a sound too loud for the space. Then she turned to the woman at the window. "Water okay for you, ma'am?" The woman nodded politely. Then Marla looked at Cairo. Her smile thinned. "Anything for you?" Cairo tried to speak clearly. "Just water, please." She stared for a second. "ID?" He blinked. "Sorry. I need to confirm your age," she said, her tone still pleasant, but the look in her eyes was sharp. "For the water," she added, even though it made no sense. She hadn't asked the others. Cairo fumbled with his wallet, pulled out his school ID and handed it over. Marla glanced at it, then handed it back without a word. She placed the water cup roughly on his tray table, so rough it nearly tipped. He stared at it, not at her, not at the others, just at the cup. She walked away before he could say anything. He didn't want to speak anyway. What would he say? That a cup of water felt like a warning? That he was being treated differently, but no one would believe it? The man next to him sipped his wine and leaned back in his seat, glancing at Cairo's hands resting on the tray. He didn't smile, just looked, then looked away. Cairo shifted in his seat. The safety video began playing on the small screen overhead, but his mind didn't follow any of it. The plane hadn't even taken off yet, and already his stomach felt hollow. His thoughts started spinning in circles. Should I have said something? Was that weird, or am I overthinking? Maybe I looked nervous. Maybe she's just strict with all kids. But he knew. Deep down, he knew this wasn't about rules. It was something else. Something that stuck to the back of your neck and made you sit straighter. Something that made you feel like you didn't belong in a seat that had already been paid for. His phone buzzed again. "All good?" He stared at the message, not answering. The plane door was still open. A few final passengers were boarding. Marla stood at the front, whispering again to the same male attendant. He held a small tablet now. She pointed toward Cairo's row with her chin. He glanced once, just once, and started typing. Cairo's heart beat faster. Not loud, not angry, just fast. He looked outside the window, but there was nothing out there except the reflection of his own face. Tense, quiet, and unsure what was about to happen next. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the doors prepared to close, casting a soft orange glow over the rows. Flight 274 was now officially on the clock, but Cairo Bell couldn't stop watching the crew's movements. Every whisper, every glance between Marla and the other flight attendant felt like it had something to do with him. Maybe it didn't. Maybe he was just being paranoid. But deep down, something wasn't sitting right. He shifted in his seat, tried to adjust the air vent above his head, then stopped halfway through. He didn't want to draw attention to himself. Not again. Not after the water. Not after the ID check. Not after the way Marla said "sweetheart" like it meant you don't belong here. Cairo stared down at the half-full cup on his tray. The plastic lid had fogged up slightly, a small droplet sliding down the inside. He hadn't taken a sip. He couldn't. Something about the way it had been handed to him made it feel like it wasn't meant for drinking. It was meant for reminding. He leaned back into the seat cushion, trying to calm the tightness in his chest. The seat felt stiff, not the soft kind that first class was supposed to offer. He wasn't in first class, but business was still supposed to be better. It was supposed to feel different. But all Cairo felt was exposed. In the row across from him, a woman in her 30s pulled a cashmere blanket up to her shoulders and took out a romance novel. She didn't even glance at Cairo. The man behind him was already asleep, head tilted back, mouth slightly open. Nobody saw it, or maybe they did and just didn't care. Cairo rubbed his palms together slowly, trying to ground himself. His dad had warned him, not with fear, but with caution. Dorian Bell didn't speak in long lectures. He gave quiet truths. Even when you're right, stay calm. Someone's always watching you with the wrong eyes. He could hear those words now like an echo in his head. Stay calm. Stay polite. Don't give them a reason. But what happens when they don't need a reason? The seatbelt light came on. The captain's voice broke through the speakers, calm and steady. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be pushing back from the gate in about 2 minutes. Flight time today is just under 4 hours. The other passengers barely looked up. Cairo didn't move. Then it happened. A soft buzz came from Marla's handheld radio. She pressed the earpiece to her ear, nodded, and walked back toward Cairo's row. This time she wasn't carrying anything. No tray, no water. Just her voice. She crouched slightly, leaning into the aisle. Her tone was low, meant to sound friendly, but it was too even, too rehearsed. Hi there. Can I ask you to step off the plane for just a moment before takeoff? She said, voice calm like she was asking him if he wanted peanuts or pretzels. Cairo blinked. Why? It's just for a quick verification, she said, smiling thinly. Standard procedure. We just need to make sure everything's in order. In order? He repeated, his mouth suddenly dry. Won't take more than a minute, she added, still crouching, still holding that same look that wasn't quite concern, wasn't quite kindness either. Cairo didn't answer. His hands went to his seatbelt instinctively, but stopped. Everything in him screamed this wasn't normal. This wasn't standard. He wasn't holding any kind of weapon. He hadn't done anything strange. He hadn't even spoken since boarding. His voice came out smaller than he intended. Is there a problem? Not necessarily, she said. We've just had some concerns from the front. That's all. That's all. Cairo's eyes darted around. Everyone was watching now. The same passengers who ignored him for the last half hour were now looking over their newspapers, peeking between seats, curious and quiet. The man beside him shifted again. The woman by the window pulled her bag slightly closer. And in that moment, Cairo realized. It didn't matter what he had done. It didn't matter how polite he was. His competition badge, his robotic slides, his school ID. None of it changed the story that had already formed around him. He thought about texting his dad. He thought about standing up and doing what she asked. But all he could do was sit still and feel the heat rise behind his eyes. Not anger, not yet. Just the quiet kind of fear that builds when you're too young to know how to stop something, and too smart to believe it will stop on its own. Cairo didn't move. His seatbelt remained fastened, his hands resting tightly on his thighs. The silence around him thickened. Marla stayed crouched, still smiling, but her eyes had gone hard. The kind of hard that didn't blink first. She wasn't asking anymore. She was waiting. His mind raced in every direction. He had followed every rule. He had arrived early, cleared security, shown his ID, stayed in his seat. He hadn't raised his voice or asked for anything twice, and still somehow he had become a problem. He looked past Marla, toward the cockpit, wondering who exactly had concerns. Had someone called her? Had she made it up? Was it just her? And if it was, what did they think he'd done? He thought about standing up, just to ask for the captain or to speak for himself. But the moment that picture entered his head, him rising from his seat in a cabin already watching him like he'd done something wrong, he froze. One wrong gesture, one panicked movement, and everything could spiral. It wasn't fair, but it was real. And he knew, deep in his chest, that fairness didn't matter here. Sir, Marla repeated, this time without the soft voice. We need to verify your travel status. I'll need you to come with me. Cairo turned toward the window. He wasn't looking at anything. He just needed to look away from her. His phone buzzed in his pocket. The vibration felt louder than it was. He glanced down. One word on the lock screen from his dad. Status? Cairo didn't reply. Not yet. Instead, he lifted his eyes and met Marla's face fully for the first time since she'd crouched beside him. What did I do? He asked, voice low but steady. Marla blinked. The question threw her off just enough for the smile to slip. It's just routine, she answered too quickly. "We've had irregular behavior flagged. The front desk thought it best to confirm." "What behavior?" She didn't answer. She didn't have one. Her gaze flicked down toward his backpack in the overhead bin, and then back to his face. Cairo's stomach sank. She didn't have a reason. She had a suspicion, or worse, a story she was ready to believe. The male flight attendant returned, standing behind her now, arms folded. A second layer of pressure, a barrier. "You can bring your bag," the man said. "We'll return it to you before takeoff." Before Cairo could even respond, someone in row 7 muttered under their breath, "It's always something." The words weren't meant to be loud, but Cairo heard them. So did the row behind him. A couple of light chuckles followed. Someone shifted in their seat. His ears felt hot. His hands were cold. His mind kept bouncing between his robotic slides and the way Marla was staring at him now, like he was a locked door she didn't want to open, but had already judged. And then something in him gave way. Not anger, not pride, just a small thread of decision that snapped clean. He slowly reached down to unbuckle his seatbelt. The click was sharp in the silence. Then calmly, he pulled out his phone, turned slightly in his seat, and typed a single word in reply to his dad's message. "Issue." He hit send. Then he stood up, not quickly, not slowly. Just enough to show he wasn't afraid, but he wasn't stupid either. He reached up and grabbed his backpack. It felt heavier than before, not because of what was inside, but because of what it now represented. As he stepped into the aisle, he glanced one last time at the passengers still watching him, most of them too polite to stare openly, but not polite enough to look away. And then he walked past Marla and the other attendant, who didn't thank him, didn't explain, didn't look sorry. They just turned and led him back toward the front of the plane. Behind him, the cabin door was still open, and outside that door, someone else was already moving. Cairo stepped into the front galley with slow, measured steps. His backpack hung from one shoulder now, the strap digging slightly into his collarbone, but he didn't adjust it. His jaw was tight, his eyes scanning the area. No one explained what was happening. No one offered a seat. They just stood there, Marla on his left, arms crossed, the other attendant checking something on a small screen mounted near the beverage cabinet. The curtain behind them swayed gently, and from the corner of his eye, Cairo could see the pilot's arm through the half-closed cockpit door. The cabin door was still cracked open. The air outside was cooler, sharper, leaking into the stale stillness of the plane's interior. Somewhere out beyond the gate, the airport was moving, carts rolling, jet engines rumbling faintly. But inside this space, time had slowed down. Marla tapped her earpiece and leaned closer to Cairo, lowering her voice. "Security will be arriving shortly, okay? They just want to ask a few questions, make sure everything lines up. Then we'll get you back in your seat." She said it like a favor, as if she was doing him a kindness. Cairo looked at her, searching her face for some sign, of doubt, of realization, of hesitation. But there was none, just the same composed expression she'd had since the moment she asked for his ID over a cup of water, like she had already made peace with whatever story she'd chosen to tell herself. He wanted to ask, "What exactly did I do?" But he already knew it wouldn't matter, because when people don't see you, they don't need a reason, just a feeling. And her feeling had now become enough to delay a flight and call in airport police. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. His palms were sweaty, and the longer he stood there, the more it felt like he was shrinking. Not physically, but in the way people look at you when they've already decided you're a problem they need to solve. And then he heard it. Footsteps, not hurried, not loud, but steady. A voice followed, calm, firm, familiar. "Where is passenger Bell?" Cairo turned his head, quickly this time. And there, just outside the cabin door, stood a tall figure in full police uniform. The dark navy jacket, crisp pants, heavy belt, and silver badge all in place. The man's face was calm, but his eyes were scanning everything. Not with panic, not with anger, just with quiet calculation. It was his father, Lieutenant Dorian Bell. For a second, Cairo didn't move. The shock didn't come from seeing his father. It came from the way the space reacted to him. Marla straightened. The other attendant lowered his eyes. Even the ground staff just beyond the gate paused, unsure whether to speak or step aside. Dorian stepped onto the plane without asking. His voice didn't rise. He didn't need to ask if Cairo was okay. One glance was enough. He took a slow breath and looked directly at Marla. I received a message from my son. What exactly is the issue here? His tone was low, polite, and controlled, but it cut through the air like cold steel. Marla opened her mouth, but no words came out at first. She blinked, clearly not expecting this version of parent to walk through the cabin door. Not like this, not in uniform, not with a badge that held more authority than hers ever would. We had some concerns from the crew, sir, she began, her voice a little higher now, a little less certain. About some behavior. It's just protocol. Dorian looked at her in silence for a full 2 seconds before responding. My son is 15. He was sitting in his assigned seat. He boarded with his proper documents. He texted me that a flight attendant requested ID to serve him a cup of water, then had him removed from his seat without explanation. I'm going to ask you again, directly. What exactly did he do that warranted that call? Marla glanced toward the other attendant. He busied himself with the tablet. Dorian's hand rested lightly near his radio, not threatening, just grounded. His voice stayed even, but now it carried weight. If you can't give me a clear answer, then I'll be filing a bias report with the Aviation Behavior Review Board. On the spot. Cairo felt something shift in the air. Not loud, not dramatic, but real. Marla hesitated. It might have been a misunderstanding. Dorian took a slow step forward. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a choice. And you made it. Cairo's throat tightened. For the first time since he stepped on the plane, he felt taller. Not because anything had changed about him, but because someone who looked like him had walked in with more authority than the people who had tried to reduce him. And in that moment, Cairo understood something very clearly. This flight was never about a seat or a safety protocol. It was about what people expect when they see someone who looks like him in a space they don't think he fits into. And his dad, he didn't yell, he didn't threaten. He just stood there, silent, firm, and dressed in the very uniform that should have protected his son from being seen as a threat in the first place. But it hadn't. And now someone would have to answer for that. Marla took a step back. Her lips parted slightly, as if she had more to say, but the words never formed. Her eyes flicked between Cairo and Lieutenant Dorian Bell, trying to find a safe place to land, but there wasn't one anymore. The uniform, the badge, the calm, but heavy, voice. It had all landed too cleanly, too sharply, and now she was standing inside the exact spotlight she'd spent years avoiding, a spotlight she never expected would come from someone like him. I didn't mean any harm, she finally said, barely above a whisper. We just had to be cautious. You understand, right? Dorian tilted his head slightly. He didn't blink. I don't. He wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. Cairo had seen his dad speak this way once before, when a city council member had tried to brush off a pattern of patrol stops that targeted teens in certain zip codes. Calm tone, steady pace, no shouting. But the words left bruises. Marla stepped aside now, her back stiff, and the other attendant quietly disappeared through the curtain toward the rear. No one wanted to be part of this anymore, not directly. Cairo stood a few feet behind his father, his backpack still slung over one shoulder. He hadn't said a word yet. He didn't know how to. His chest was tight with everything. Shame, relief, anger, and something else he hadn't named yet. Maybe it was sadness, not because of what happened, but because of how normal it had felt to be singled out, because somewhere in him, he had expected it. And that expectation hurt more than the moment itself. Dorian turned slightly toward him. You okay? Cairo nodded slowly. But Dorian knew better. He didn't press. He didn't say, you should have called sooner, or why didn't you speak up? He just looked at his son with eyes that understood too well the weight of quiet injustice. Then he turned back to Marla, who was now clutching her service manual like it might protect her. "Here's what's going to happen," Dorian said. "My son will return to his seat. This flight will depart as scheduled, and your supervisor will receive a formal complaint along with a transcript of this interaction. If any record of this incident lists him as a disruption, I will personally file a grievance with the Department of Transportation and request an independent audit of your crew's bias record. Is that clear?" Marla nodded, her lips pressed thin. "And," Dorian added, "if anyone from this cabin so much as glances at my son with anything less than full professionalism, I will request body cam footage from every gate surveillance camera starting from check-in. I know exactly how long those archives are kept." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, packed with the kind of gravity no apology could undo. And still, none came. No one said, "We're sorry." No one said, "This was a mistake." Because they knew it wasn't a mistake. It was a decision. And now they were standing in front of someone who didn't accept quiet racism disguised as caution. Cairo didn't speak as he followed his father back through the aisle. The passengers looked down, looked away, adjusted their blankets, suddenly found deep interest in their seatbelt buckles and in-flight magazines. A few stole quick glances, but they dropped just as fast when they saw who was walking ahead of him. When he reached row 6 again, Cairo paused. The same seat, the same small plastic cup of water still sitting untouched on the tray table. He slid back in and buckled his seatbelt. His fingers moved slowly this time, but with purpose. His dad stood in the aisle beside him for a few more seconds. "You remember what I told you?" he asked quietly, just for him. Cairo nodded. "Stay calm. Keep my ID on me." Dorian nodded once. "You followed every rule. This isn't your shame to carry." Then he reached into his coat pocket and handed Cairo something folded, just in case. It was a printed copy of the Robotics Nationals itinerary, stamped and signed by his school principal, with a second sheet, his name, competition number, school address, and emergency contact. Official, laminated. "You go win that trophy," Dorian said. Then he turned and walked out the cabin door without another word. The door shut behind him with a quiet click. The plane began to move. The plane eased back from the gate, its wheels bumping softly against the concrete as it turned toward the runway. Inside the cabin, everything returned to normal. On the surface. But for Cairo Bell, nothing about this flight felt normal anymore. The flight attendants moved down the aisle, doing safety checks, speaking in quiet, rehearsed tones, and avoiding eye contact with row 6 entirely. Marla didn't pass his row again. Another crew member, one who hadn't been involved earlier, walked through instead, head down, smile tight. Cairo sat still, arms crossed over his chest, his backpack now wedged between his feet. The laminated sheet from his father sat folded on his tray table. He hadn't put it away yet. A part of him didn't want to. Not because he needed it, but because it reminded him that someone had shown up when it counted. Someone had seen him. But even that couldn't erase what had happened before. His eyes drifted to the front of the plane, where the curtain had been drawn shut, the same spot he had been pulled to, the same space where the silence had been louder than any shouting could have been. The place where he had been asked to explain himself without ever being told what crime he was defending against. His chest still felt tight. He leaned back against the seat, trying to steady his breathing. But the pressure hadn't left. The whispers from before still echoed in his head. It's always something. Wrong section. Unaccompanied minor. Each phrase harmless on the surface, but soaked in quiet judgment. He stared at the cup of water again. The plastic lid had a slight crack in it now, probably from how hard it had been placed on his tray earlier. He hadn't touched it. He wouldn't. It was more than water now. It was a reminder of how quickly people can turn a kid into a threat based on nothing but a glance. The man beside him, who had avoided speaking the entire time, finally shifted. He cleared his throat, then leaned in slightly. "You handled that well," he said, his voice low. Cairo didn't look at him. "I didn't do anything." "I know," the man replied. "That's what I meant." There was a pause, a long one. Cairo's hands tightened around the edge of the tray table. It wasn't that he needed validation from a stranger. It wasn't that he needed anyone to explain what had happened. He understood exactly what had happened. That's what made it worse. There was nothing unclear about it. He had done everything right. He had been polite, prepared, quiet. But none of that had shielded him. And that's what sat heavy in his chest now. Not just the injustice, but the understanding that it wouldn't be the last time. This wouldn't be the final time someone looked at him, tall and brown-skinned with a laptop in hand, and saw trouble instead of talent. And no amount of medals or printouts or polite behavior could stop it from happening again. The captain's voice came over the speaker. "Flight attendants, please take your seats for takeoff." The engines hummed louder. The cabin lights flickered slightly, then dimmed to a soft golden hue. The world outside the window tilted as the plane lined up on the runway. For a brief moment, Cairo looked out at the strip of light stretching into the dark. He wondered if any of the other passengers were still thinking about what happened, if anyone had taken a second to question what they'd witnessed. Probably not. People forget discomfort quickly when it doesn't land in their own seat. But he wouldn't forget. He reached down and picked up the laminated sheet from the tray table, folded it twice, and slipped it into his backpack. Then he pulled out his laptop again and opened his presentation slides. Slides he had designed with color-coded diagrams, motion detection test data, and demo photos from his school's lab. His hands hovered over the keyboard. He didn't feel like reviewing anything, but he forced himself to anyway. Not because he wanted to, but because it was his way of pushing back. He couldn't control what others thought when they looked at him, but he could control what he did with his time, his focus, his talent. The plane roared forward, gaining speed. Cairo stared at the screen, trying to absorb the words, the numbers, the clean layout he had once been so proud of. His fingers finally tapped one key, then another. He began reading aloud softly to himself under his breath. This project uses ultrasonic sensors to detect physical movement and calculate directionality within a 180-degree field. His voice was quiet, but it was steady, and for now, that was enough. The plane climbed steadily into the night sky, cutting through clouds like they weren't even there. Inside, the cabin remained dim and still. Most passengers had begun to settle, blankets draped over knees, seatbacks tilted slightly, earbuds tucked in. But Cairo Bell sat upright, hands still resting near his keyboard, eyes fixed on the softly glowing screen in front of him. He wasn't reading anymore. The words on his slide blurred at the edges, though he hadn't blinked in a while. He just stared, letting the silence stretch. It wasn't a peaceful kind of silence. It was the kind that came after a storm, not because things had calmed, but because everything inside had been pushed down to keep from spilling over. He wanted to feel proud again. That's what this trip was supposed to be about. His school had taken photos when he'd qualified. His principal had called him our future engineer. He'd even smiled for his mom's camera, twice, at the airport drop-off, even though he hated pictures. He had felt something then, something close to possibility, like he was stepping into a new space, one that maybe had room for him. But now, all of it felt thin, stretched, like a story told by someone who wasn't sure of the ending anymore. He closed the laptop slowly, the soft click louder than expected in the quiet cabin. He placed it gently back into his backpack and zipped it, pressing the zipper all the way to the corner as if sealing the tension with it. His eyes drifted toward the aisle. The flight attendant who had replaced Marla on the cabin rotation came by quietly with a cart of snacks. She didn't stop at his row. She served the passenger behind him, then moved on without a glance. Cairo didn't care about pretzels or soda. But still, it stung. He looked down at his hands. His fingers, long and slim, had dirt under the nails from the project set up that morning. He hadn't noticed it earlier. He rubbed his thumb across one fingernail, trying to scrape it clean. It reminded him of something his dad used to say when Cairo was younger and building robots out of Legos. People won't always see what your hands are capable of, he'd say. They'll just look at the color first. Your job is to do the work anyway. Cairo kept rubbing the edge of his thumbnail until the skin around it turned red. He wasn't angry, not exactly. He was tired. And that tiredness didn't come from the early morning or the weight of the backpack or the climb to 30,000 feet. It came from holding himself in place, from shrinking, from making himself smaller and quieter and more acceptable for people who still found ways to see him as a threat. He leaned his head back and stared at the ceiling. The small overhead light above his seat glowed faintly, catching the edge of his cheek. He wondered, would this be the story people told about this flight? Would anyone remember the boy who got pulled from his seat for no reason? Or would they only remember that the plane landed safely and nothing went wrong? He wished he could forget it. He wished it had just been a flight with soda and legroom and a window seat and nothing else. But now it was marked, burned into him, and he hadn't even left the East Coast yet. From a few rows back, a child laughed, a soft, silly giggle that floated over the hum of the engines. Cairo glanced over his shoulder but couldn't see the kid. Just the sound, bright and untouched. He turned back to face forward and slowly he pulled the window shade up. Outside, the world was black, but above, the stars were sharp, scattered across the sky like pinholes in velvet. He hadn't expected to see so many, not with the city lights below, but they were there. Unbothered, untouched, unchanged. He leaned slightly toward the glass, letting the cool window press against his temple. And for the first time since he'd boarded, he let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. He didn't cry, but something inside him softened. Not because it was over, but because he had survived it, without shouting, without breaking. And that, he realized, was its own kind of resistance. The plane had leveled out now, cruising steady above the clouds. Cairo Bell stayed motionless by the window, his breath slightly fogging the glass. He didn't wipe it away. The faint blur on the window felt like the world matched his mind, muffled, half-clear, still spinning. Somewhere below them, cities were glowing, lives moving on, people sleeping in homes where they felt safe. But 30,000 feet in the air, Cairo sat wondering what safety actually meant when you could be treated like a threat for nothing more than showing up. He slowly shifted his position, tucking one leg under the other. The seat creaked gently. He glanced toward the aisle again. Marla hadn't returned, but he could feel the quiet that followed her, like a perfume that lingered even after someone left a room. The man sitting next to him had put on headphones, not noise-canceling ones. Cairo could still hear the faint thump of bass, probably something old school. He looked like the type, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that no one had said anything else to him. Not a single crew member, not even to check if he needed a blanket or headphones or if he was comfortable. It was easier for them this way. Avoiding was always safer than admitting, safer than facing the way discomfort settles when you're forced to look at something too close. He reached into his hoodie pocket and pulled out the bracelet his dad had given him, a simple black band with a small square chip embedded on the inside. GPS linked, his father had insisted. Not for control, he'd said, for peace of mind. Cairo had rolled his eyes at the time. Now he rubbed the chip slowly between his fingers. How many 15-year-olds flew with location tracking on their wrist because their parents were scared, not of the world outside, but of how the world would see them inside places like this? He swallowed. Not fear, just truth. He stared at the back of the seat in front of him, where a laminated safety card stuck out from the pouch. He reached for it without thinking and turned it over in his hands. His mind wasn't on the diagrams. It drifted instead to his school, his team, his robot, safely packed in a separate cargo case under the plane. He thought about how proud his teacher had looked when they reviewed his project timeline, how excited his classmates had been when he told them about the trip. He had imagined this flight as a stretch of calm before the storm of competition. Maybe review his code, watch a movie, snack on something too salty, fall asleep with his head against the window. Now it was something else entirely. This flight had given him another kind of education, one that didn't come with blueprints or circuit boards, one he didn't ask for. He leaned his head back again, breathing slow. It wasn't just about what had happened earlier. It was the way people around him had stayed quiet. The man behind him who muttered, "It's always something," but never looked again. The woman across the aisle who pulled her purse close. The attendant who watched Marla whisper but kept serving drinks. He thought about that. Not with bitterness, but with clarity. This was the part that stuck. Not the accusation itself, but the quiet that let it happen. His phone was in his lap, screen black. He tapped it once and unlocked it. A message from his dad still glowed near the top. "Let me know if anything changes. I'm nearby." Nearby. Even at cruising altitude, even after walking off the plane, his dad was still close. That thought hit him harder than anything else. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just solid. Like a wall standing behind you when everything else feels paper thin. Cairo typed back slowly. Back in seat. Plane in air. Good now. He paused, stared at the blinking cursor, then added, "Thanks for coming." He hit send, then placed the phone face down on the tray table. He didn't want to watch the rest of the movie he had planned to stream. He didn't want snacks. He just wanted this flight to be over. And not because he was afraid. Because he had things to do. A competition to win, a robot to present, a name to defend. Not because it was on trial, but because people kept treating it like it was. Cairo leaned his forehead against the window again. The stars were still there. They didn't blink. They didn't shift. They just stayed where they were, visible, solid, indifferent. And maybe that's what he needed now. Not comfort, not apology, just space to be, unbothered, untouched, still. The hours passed slowly, stretched by the kind of silence that doesn't invite sleep. The kind that lingers in the chest and keeps the mind pacing, even when the body stays still. Cairo Bell hadn't moved much since takeoff. The cabin lights had been dimmed further after the drink service, casting a soft bluish glow that made everything look quieter than it was. Some passengers had slipped into sleep with their heads tilted, neck pillows propped awkwardly. A few screens still glowed here and there, half-watched movies, paused games, but most of the plane had gone still. But Cairo didn't close his eyes. He sat in row 6, seat C, upright and wide awake. Not because he wasn't tired, he was. But the kind of tired he felt didn't come from his body. It came from what he was holding in his head. A string of thoughts that kept tightening. He replayed it again. The boarding, the first glance from Marla, the ID check for water, the whispered conversations, the moment she asked him to step off. And then the sound of his father's boots against the jet bridge floor. It looped in pieces, not as one long scene, just snapshots. A flicker of her expression. The way passengers turned but never spoke. His own silence, how he hadn't asked why until it was too late. And how even that didn't matter. She hadn't answered. And what stuck with him the most, what dug deeper the longer he sat here, was how quickly everything had unfolded. How little time it took for someone to press a button and quietly decide he was worth calling someone for. Not because of what he said, not because of what he did, just because. He shifted again, rubbing his eyes. Not because he was sleepy, but to press something back inside. He wasn't angry anymore. Not exactly. He wasn't scared either. That part had passed when his dad walked in and took up the space no one else dared fill. What he felt now was harder to name. It was something that sat deep, like disappointment, but bigger, wider. Like the shape of something you can't quite describe, only feel. He picked up his phone again and scrolled without really looking, just needing something to move beneath his fingers. After a few seconds, he opened the photo app and went to the folder marked Project Bellbot. There it was, a row of progress pictures. His robot, version 1, bulky and uneven. Version 2, smoother, but still glitchy. Version 3, clean, silver frame, light sensors working, full range motion. The last picture was from the school lab just 2 days ago. The robot standing upright, red LED light blinking in its core. A faint reflection of Cairo's face showed in the glass table beneath it, half smiling. He stared at that reflection now, and something in his chest pulled tight. That kid, smiling, still felt a little too far away. He tilted the phone down, then placed it back in his hoodie pocket. He thought about his dad again, how he'd walked in with full uniform, zero hesitation, not a flicker of uncertainty, how he'd spoken clearly and directly, while the flight attendants suddenly forgot the story they'd been building. And it made him wonder, why does it take a badge for people to listen? Why did it take a uniform to make them pause? Would they have even looked twice if his dad had walked in wearing jeans and a t-shirt? The question stung, because he already knew the answer. And yet, that truth didn't make him feel smaller. Not now, not anymore. It made him sharper, more awake, like he'd just understood something bigger than the flight, bigger than the humiliation, bigger than the apology he never got. It was this: the world didn't bend toward fairness on its own. You had to push it, not by yelling, but by showing up, by standing in your place when someone tried to move you, by making sure that if they saw you as a problem, you became a problem they had to answer for. He pressed his back into the seat and let his shoulders settle. Then slowly, he reached into his bag and pulled out his notebook. Not the laptop this time. The notebook. The one with handwritten sketches, diagrams, little thoughts scribbled in corners. He flipped past the pages of design models and landed on a blank sheet. Then he picked up a pen. Not to work on his robot. Not yet. Instead, at the top of the page, he wrote in small block letters, Seat 6C, day they tried to make me invisible. And underneath it, he began to write, not a complaint, not a rant, just a clear list. What happened, what was said, what wasn't said, who looked away, what he felt, and what it all meant. Because he knew something now. He wouldn't just win by building robots. He would win by remembering, by making sure the silence didn't erase him, by leaving behind more than just a story people might forget. He would leave a record. The pen moved slowly in Cairo Bell's hand, the point scratching lightly against the paper as the engine hummed beneath him. The words didn't come quickly. They weren't dramatic or poetic, just true, one thought at a time, simple, clear, brutal in their plainness. Flight attendant asked for ID to serve me water. Told to step off the plane without explanation. Passengers watched. No one said a word. Father arrived in uniform. Tone in the room changed. He paused after that last one. His fingers hovered above the paper, gripping the pen a little tighter now. He stared at the sentence, unsure whether to underline it or cross it out or just leave it as it was. It said too much and not enough all at once. Why did it have to take that? Why wasn't his presence enough? He'd done everything right. Carried himself carefully, sat quietly, moved respectfully, and yet all it took was a glance, a suspicion, and a story was written around him before he had the chance to speak a single line. He blinked slowly and looked up, not at anything in particular, just to give his eyes a rest. His neck cracked slightly as he rolled his shoulders. The seat still felt stiff under him. The air around him hadn't warmed. He thought back to the terminal, to the moment before it all started. He had felt nervous, yes, but also excited. He'd replayed his presentation in his head, his practice speech timed almost perfectly. He'd even thought about what snack he might get on the plane, whether he should skip it to stay sharp. That version of himself, the one with the medal around his neck and the school cheering him on, felt like a ghost now. Not gone, but flickering. He wondered how long it would take to get that feeling back. The one where the world didn't feel like it had its thumb pressing gently, constantly, on the top of his head. He flipped to the next page and wrote a single line at the top. What I wanted from this flight. Underneath it, he started a quiet list. Peace sleep. To feel proud. To be left alone, to be seen only as a student. The last one stopped him. He stared at it, then lightly circled the word only. He didn't want special attention. He didn't need to be praised for boarding a plane or winning a school prize. He just wanted the same blank slate assumption other kids got, the benefit of the doubt. But instead, he had been forced to prove something no one else had to prove. That he wasn't dangerous, that he belonged in that seat. And no one had said it out loud. That was the worst part. No slurs, no threats. Just soft smiles that felt sharp. Quiet requests that sounded polite but landed hard. That's how it always was. Subtle, measured, but heavy. He lowered the pen again, writing slower now. They didn't yell. They didn't accuse. But they made me feel like I had to earn the right to sit down. The page stared back at him, and he stared back, unmoving. He hadn't cried. Not on the plane. Not at the gate. Not when Marla looked at him like he was something she didn't trust. And not even when his dad showed up like a storm in uniform. He hadn't cried because there hadn't been room to cry. There had only been space for stillness. But now, here, in the quiet lull of a mid-air night, with the hum of the cabin and the slow rhythm of his breathing, he felt something press against the inside of his chest. Not a breakdown, just pressure. The kind that builds when you hold everything in for too long, when your body starts to notice the emotional weight before your mind gives it permission to name it. He pressed the notebook closed and set it aside. Then he reached under his seat, pulled his backpack into his lap, and unzipped it again. This time he didn't reach for the laptop or the laminated sheets. He pulled out the object wrapped in a towel, the small robot he had built for the competition. Its frame was polished silver and dark gray, its eyes 2 tiny camera lenses, its legs short and jointed like an insect. Compact, clean, efficient. He cradled it in both hands, turning it gently to check the sensors. Still working, still ready. And for the first time since boarding, a small breath escaped him. Not relief, not satisfaction, just something quieter. Something like, I still did this. They had tried to shrink him down into suspicion, but this robot, was proof of who he was when no one was looking. He placed the robot carefully back into the towel and zipped it shut, tighter this time. Not to hide it, but to protect it, the same way he'd been trying to protect himself all night. Then he looked out the window again. The stars hadn't moved, but something in him had. He wasn't the same as he had been before the flight. Not bitter, not broken, just changed. More awake. And from this moment forward, he wouldn't ask for the benefit of the doubt. He'd build something bigger than it. By the time the captain's voice crackled through the overhead speakers announcing the start of descent, Cairo Bell had already packed his things, not in a rush, not nervously, just carefully, intentionally. Each item went back in its place. The robot, wrapped snug again. The notebook slid between 2 folders. The pen clipped to the inside pocket. His hands moved without hurry, but with the quiet precision of someone who'd had enough time to sit with his thoughts and now needed something to do with them. The rest of the cabin slowly came back to life. Blankets were folded, seats returned to upright, conversations restarted in soft, scratchy voices. The man beside him yawned, stretched once, and gave Cairo a polite nod. Still no real words. That was fine. Cairo wasn't in the mood for talking anyway. He looked out the window. Morning had started to bleed into the edge of the horizon, just a pale streak of orange resting on the curve of the world. The rest was still blue-black, with faint city lights scattered far below like broken glass on pavement. It was quiet, but a different kind of quiet than before. Less tense, more reflective. He thought about how much had shifted in just a few hours, how the day had started with excitement, turned into something cold and unfamiliar, and then settled here, in this strange middle space between pain and clarity. His back still ached from sitting too stiff for too long. His fingers were sore from holding the pen tighter than necessary, and his chest, well, that still held something heavy. But it wasn't fear anymore, or confusion. It was something more solid. Conviction, maybe. The intercom clicked again. The flight attendant, not Marla, asked everyone to power down devices and stow away tray tables. Cairo followed the instructions without thinking, but his mind stayed busy. He wondered if the crew had talked about him, if there had been a meeting in the back galley while the passengers slept, If Marla had tried to explain herself to her co-workers, maybe tried to twist the story into something cleaner, something easier to digest. He just seemed off. We were following protocol. I didn't mean anything by it. That's the part that stuck with him more than anything. That didn't mean anything by it. He'd heard it before, in school, at the store, at events when adults asked where his parents were like he couldn't possibly be there on his own. The phrase came in many forms, but it always meant the same thing. They didn't want to see it, so they wouldn't call it what it was. But Cairo had learned tonight. Just because something's not loud doesn't mean it's not dangerous. Sometimes, the quietest harm is the kind that sinks deepest. He pulled the laminated itinerary from his hoodie pocket, the one his father had printed for him. He unfolded it, smoothing out the crease lines with the back of his fingers. At the bottom, where the school logo sat, his principal had written in pen, "Go make us proud." The words used to feel exciting, like a challenge. Now they felt heavier, not because he doubted he could, but because he knew exactly what it would cost. He folded it again and tucked it back into the front of his backpack. As the plane dipped lower through the clouds, Cairo's thoughts turned toward Seattle, the competition, the other kids. He wondered if they would notice anything in him, if he'd be quieter than usual, if they'd ask about his trip, and if he'd answer honestly or just say, "It was fine," and leave it there. Maybe he'd tell them, maybe not. He wasn't sure yet, but he was sure of this. He would present his project, stand in front of the judges, explain every detail of the ultrasonic sensors, the data models, the movement range, and if someone looked at him with doubt in their eyes, he wouldn't flinch, because tonight had stripped something from him, but it had given him something too, a different kind of armor, not built from anger, not shaped from pride, just crafted out of truth. And the truth was this: he had been tested before the competition even began, pulled from his seat, watched, judged, measured against an invisible standard that kept changing, and still, he remained, in his seat, with his project, and with his father's voice still echoing in the back of his mind. "You followed every rule. This isn't your shame to carry." He didn't carry it now. He carried his bag. He carried his robot. And he carried every word he had written in that notebook. That would be enough. The plane wheels touched the runway with a low screech, followed by a soft bounce that sent a shiver through the floor. Cairo Bell felt it in his spine, in his arms, in the soles of his feet. His body instinctively braced itself, even though the moment passed in seconds. Just like that, Flight 274 was on solid ground again. But Cairo's mind wasn't there yet. As the plane slowed, its engines shifting to a dull hum, his thoughts stayed circling up in the dark sky above, still floating somewhere between what had happened and what was coming next, still wondering how he was supposed to go from that to this, from being treated like a threat to now quietly shuffling out of a plane like nothing happened. The seatbelt sign dinged, the cabin lights brightened to a soft white. Passengers around him stretched and stirred, the usual post-flight rustling beginning. He sat still, his hands rested on his thighs, fingertips pressing gently into the fabric of his pants. He listened to the sounds, seatbelts unbuckling, overhead bins creaking open, plastic bags crinkling. A few voices murmured about connecting flights and rental cars. Life resumed. But for him, the moment still hung in the air like a room where someone had just shouted, and no one wanted to mention it. The man beside him stood and reached for his carry-on. As he did, he paused, just for a second, and looked down at Cairo. "Take care, kid," he said. Cairo glanced up, gave a small nod. He didn't know what else to do with the comment. He appreciated it maybe, or maybe not. It was hard to tell. The words were soft, but they didn't undo the silence from earlier. Still, they were something. A small flicker in a space that had mostly chosen to stay dim. He waited until the aisle had cleared a bit before standing. He moved slowly, methodically, no rush. He reached for his backpack, slung it over one shoulder, and double-checked the front pocket. Robot secured, notebook sealed. Everything that mattered was still with him. As he stepped into the aisle, he felt it again. that invisible weight that always seemed to come when he moved through spaces not built with him in mind. The way eyes sometimes lingered, the way people gave just enough room but never too much warmth. It was subtle, always subtle, but he had learned to feel it. He walked past the rows, past the curtained galley, past the door where everything had shifted hours earlier. Marla wasn't there. She had been replaced by another attendant with short dark hair and tired eyes, who said nothing and didn't meet his gaze. That was fine. He didn't need eye contact now. He didn't need a final word. The damage had already been done and survived. He stepped off the plane and into the tunnel. The air was cooler here, thinner, like the transition between two stories that didn't match. He followed the narrow path toward the gate. His shoes tapped quietly against the rubber flooring, each step forward soft but sure. At the end of the tunnel, the brightness of the terminal opened up around him. White lights, blinking arrival screens, people in business suits walking fast. A family struggling with too many bags. Someone on the phone talking loudly about a hotel shuttle. He kept moving. Somewhere ahead, a volunteer held a sign with his school's name on it. West Grant Regional STEM. The woman holding it wore a yellow staff lanyard and smiled when she spotted him. "You must be Cairo. Glad you made it in safe," she said cheerfully. He nodded, adjusting the strap on his shoulder. "Yeah, thanks." She started talking about baggage claim and schedules, but her voice faded slightly as he scanned the terminal. He spotted something near the window, a man in uniform, standing tall, not moving. Lieutenant Dorian Bell, his dad. Their eyes met. Dorian gave the smallest nod. Didn't wave, didn't walk over, just stood there, watching, making sure. Cairo didn't smile, not because he wasn't glad to see him, but because something about that moment felt like it needed stillness. They didn't need words. Not yet. Not here. He nodded back, then turned, and kept walking. Because this next part, the competition, the presentation, the crowd, this was his space. One no one could shrink him out of. Not now, not after everything. Not when he was still standing. The auditorium buzzed with low chatter and distant footsteps as teams moved in and out of the backstage area. Bright banners hung from the rafters. National Youth Robotics Challenge 2025. Rows of display booths lined the walls, each decorated with diagrams, screens, and carefully positioned robots. Some students ran through their speeches one last time. Others paced. Some just sat with their eyes closed, headphones in, trying to block it all out. Cairo Bell stood behind his assigned table, booth number 34. His robot sat center stage, small, sleek, wires hidden, sensors glowing a steady green. The judges had already passed once, asking a few polite questions and scribbling notes on their clipboards. His live demonstration was next. 10 minutes. That was all he had. He adjusted the collar of his school-issued polo, smoothed the edge of the white paper display board, and glanced at his reflection in the screen of his tablet. His face looked calmer than he felt. Inside there was a quiet storm still moving through him. Not panic, not nerves. Just the residue of everything. The plane, the looks, the water, the tray, the silence, the call, the walk, the words, the badge, the eyes that shifted the moment his father appeared. It hadn't left him. It wouldn't for a long time. But he was learning how to carry it differently. He wasn't pretending it hadn't happened. He wasn't pushing it down. He had written it down, page by page, while the world slept. He had folded it into his notes not to hide it, but to remind himself that even when people tried to erase him, he had the tools to leave a mark. And now he would. Not by shouting, not by retelling the story, just by standing here and being excellent anyway. He heard his name called through the speaker system. "Cairo Bell from West Grant Regional STEM. Please prepare for demonstration at table 34. He stepped forward. The lead judge, a middle-aged woman with a notepad and kind eyes, smiled and nodded. "We're ready when you are." Cairo clicked his presentation remote. His robot came to life, rolling gently forward, detecting motion, adjusting path. reacting to light inputs just as it was designed to. The judges leaned in. The crowd around him thickened slightly. The robot paused at the programmed edge, backed up, recentered, and recalibrated in under half a second. Flawless. He spoke clearly. Every technical term in place. Every design choice explained. His voice didn't shake. His hands didn't fumble. He was fully present. Even when he caught sight of someone in the back, another adult in uniform watching silently, he didn't break. It wasn't his father this time. But it didn't matter, because he didn't need anyone to rescue him anymore. He had already saved himself, by staying in that seat, by writing it down, by showing up anyway. When the judges thanked him and moved on, he didn't breathe out in relief like the other kids did. He just stood still, his heart steady. Later that afternoon, the winners were announced. He didn't win first place. He didn't need to. He placed third in the country, enough to qualify for a national grant, enough to bring recognition to his school, enough to get emails from tech mentors before the evening even ended. But more importantly, it was enough to prove that the story that began on that plane had not defined him. It had sharpened him, refined him. The injustice didn't become his identity. His response did. As the crowd thinned and awards were handed out, Cairo stepped outside for air. The late afternoon light was fading, stretching long across the concrete courtyard of the convention center. A few other students lingered, laughing, texting, taking photos. He sat on a low wall near a planter, backpack between his feet, robot still nestled safely inside. And for a moment, he did nothing. No thinking, no planning, just being. A breeze passed over his face. The hum of cars rolled by in the distance. He watched a single leaf float down and land softly near his shoe. And in that quiet, he let himself feel it fully. Not the pain, but the proof. That he had been questioned, doubted, pushed aside. And he had not disappeared. He had refused to. He pulled out his notebook one last time, opened it to the back page, and in slow, even handwriting he wrote, "They tried to remove me from the plane. I stayed. They tried to shrink me. I grew anyway. They made the call, but I made the story." Then he closed the notebook, and this time when he stood up, he didn't carry the weight. He carried the record. If this story touched you, make sure to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story like this.